Most people think they know how Nazi Germany became the most powerful military machine in Europe. The standard story goes something like this. Adolf Hitler rose to power through sheer charisma and ideology, exploiting the resentment of a humiliated nation, and then, through political will and nationalist fervor, built a war machine that nearly conquered a continent. It is a dramatic story. It is also, in many critical ways, dangerously incomplete. Because there is a question that the standard narrative almost never bothers to ask, a question so basic that its absence from most history textbooks should genuinely concern you. Where did the money come from? Where did a nation that was bankrupt, stripped of its colonies, saddled with billions in war reparations, and ravaged by the most catastrophic hyperinflation in modern history, suddenly find the capital to build the most formidable military force Europe had ever seen in just 6 years? The answer to that question does not begin in Berlin. It begins on Wall Street. Now, I'm not here to tell you that Hitler's ideology or the political conditions inside Weimar Germany or the resentment bred by the Treaty of Versailles were not important. Of course they were. But ideology alone does not build tanks. Resentment does not manufacture synthetic fuel. Nationalism does not wire a telecommunications network across an entire continent. Those things require capital. They require technology. They require industrial infrastructure. And a remarkable amount of all three came from the United States of America. That story, the story of how American money, American technology, and American corporations helped build the very machine that American soldiers would later be sent to destroy, is the one we are going to tell today. And once you understand how it happened, you will never look at the rise of the Third Reich the same way again. So let us go back, not to 1933 when Hitler took power, but further, to the wreckage of the First World War. When the guns finally fell silent in November of 1918, Europe was shattered. Roughly 10 million soldiers were dead, 20 million more were wounded. The economies of the major European powers were hollowed out by 4 years of industrial-scale killing. And the victorious Allies, particularly France and Britain, were determined to make Germany pay for every last drop of blood. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June of 1919, imposed punitive terms that were staggering in scale. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for causing the war under the infamous Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It was stripped of roughly 13% of its pre-war territory, including the coal-rich Saar Basin, Alsace-Lorraine, and large portions of its eastern frontier. All of its overseas colonies were confiscated. Its military was reduced to 100,000 men. Its navy was dismantled. And the reparations bill, finalized in 1921 by the Allied Reparations Commission, was set at 132 billion gold marks, roughly $33 billion at the time, or somewhere in the range of $500 billion in today's money. The economist John Maynard Keynes, who had served as a British Treasury representative at the Paris Peace Conference, saw immediately what this would mean. He resigned in protest and published The Economic Consequences of the Peace in 1919, warning that crushing Germany economically would not secure lasting peace, but would instead guarantee future catastrophe. He called the treaty a Carthaginian peace. He was right. By 1923, the situation inside Germany had become almost unimaginable. The government, unable to meet its reparation obligations, had resorted to printing money at a pace that defied reason. When France and Belgium occupied the industrial Ruhr Valley in January of 1923 to forcibly extract reparations in the form of coal and timber, the German government encouraged passive resistance among the workers and compensated them by printing even more money. The result was the most extreme hyperinflation the modern world had ever witnessed. The German mark, which had traded at roughly 4.2 to the American dollar before the war, plummeted to 4.2 trillion to the dollar by November of 1923. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January of 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. People literally needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy basic groceries. Lifetime savings were wiped out overnight. The entire middle class was effectively destroyed. And this is not just an interesting economic footnote. This economic annihilation is what created the political soil from which extremism would grow. The desperation, the anger, the sense that the entire system had failed, that is what made a figure like Hitler possible. But it also created something else, an opportunity. An opportunity for the most powerful financial institutions on earth to step in, restructure the situation, and in the process, earn extraordinary returns. And that is exactly what Wall Street did. In 1924, a committee of international financial experts was convened to solve the German reparations crisis. It was led by Charles G. Dawes, an American banker, former director of the U.S. Bureau of the Budget, and a partner at the Central Trust Company of Illinois. The resulting Dawes Plan, announced in April of 1924, was designed to stabilize Germany and get the reparations flowing again. It provided an initial loan of 800 million gold marks to the German government, approximately half of which was raised through a massive bond issue underwritten by J.P. Morgan and Company in the United States. The plan set a staggered reparation schedule, starting at 1 billion gold marks annually and rising to 2.5 billion by 1928. And it effectively put American bankers in a supervisory role over Germany's central bank and railway system, ensuring that the reparation payments would be prioritized. Dawes won the Nobel Peace Prize for this in 1925. But here's the critical thing that most people do not understand about the Dawes Plan. It did not solve the fundamental problem. It created a bizarre and deeply fragile circular flow of capital. American banks lent money to Germany. Germany used that money to pay reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France then used those reparation payments to service their own war debts back to the United States. The money was essentially going in a giant circle, with Wall Street earning interest at every stage of the journey. It was brilliant, it was profitable, and it was a house of cards. Once the Dawes Plan opened the door, American capital flooded into Germany. Between 1924 and 1931, Wall Street underwrote an estimated $1.5 billion to $2 billion in loans to German municipal governments, state-owned enterprises, utilities, and private corporations. The firms doing the underwriting were not fringe operators. They were the most powerful names in American finance. J.P. Morgan and Company, Dillon Red and Company, which alone underwrote more than $900 million in German bonds. National City Bank, the precursor to Citibank, Goldman Sachs, Lee Higginson. These loans were enormously profitable for Wall Street, and they accomplished something that reparations payments alone could never have achieved. They rebuilt and modernized German industry on a massive scale. New factories, new infrastructure, new technology, the very same industrial base that would, within a decade, be converted to military production. And in 1929, the arrangement was restructured once more under the Young Plan, designed by Owen D. Young, the American industrialist and founder of RCA. The Young Plan reduced total German reparations to 112 billion Reichsmarks payable over 59 years, with annual installments of roughly 473 million. But perhaps more significantly, the Young Plan led to the creation of the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, established in Basel, Switzerland in 1930. The BIS was designed to manage reparation transfers between central banks. It would go on to play a far darker role in the years ahead. Keep that institution in mind. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that should make you deeply uncomfortable. In October of 1929, the American stock market crashed. The Great Depression began, and Wall Street banks, suddenly desperate for liquidity, began calling in their short-term loans to Germany. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The flow of American capital that had been keeping the German economy alive simply stopped. German banks collapsed in a chain reaction. The Donat Bank, one of the country's largest, failed in July of 1931, triggering a banking crisis that forced the government to impose a moratorium on all foreign debt payments. Unemployment soared to over 6 million by 1932, roughly 30% of the German workforce. The Weimar Republic, already fragile, began to disintegrate. And into that vacuum of despair and institutional failure stepped Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Now, Hitler did not build his movement on nothing. He had financial backers, and some of the most important among them had deep connections to American finance. Fritz Thyssen, the immensely wealthy German steel and coal industrialist, was one of the earliest and most significant financial supporters of the Nazi Party. Thyssen would later admit as much in his memoir, I Paid Hitler, published in 1941. And here's the connection that most textbooks leave out entirely. Thyssen's banking operations in the United States were managed through the Union Banking Corporation, a New York institution established in 1924 to serve as the American financial conduit for Thyssen's interests through the Rotterdam-based Bank for Handel and Scheepvaart. Among the directors of the Union Banking Corporation was a man named Prescott Bush, a partner at the influential investment firm Brown Brothers Harriman. In October of 1942, the United States government seized the assets of the Union Banking Corporation under the Trading with the Enemy Act. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The seizure order is in the National Archives. Now, let us talk about Hjalmar Schacht, because he is the hinge on which this entire financial story turns. Schacht was the president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, and he served as Hitler's Minister of Economics from 1934 to 1937. He was, by any measure, a financial genius. But more importantly for our story, he was a man with deep and personal connections to the highest levels of Anglo-American finance. Schacht had spent the 1920s cultivating these relationships with extraordinary deliberateness. He toured the United States, dining with the heads of major Wall Street banks and building friendships that went far beyond the merely professional. He corresponded regularly with Benjamin Strong, the powerful head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and enjoyed a particularly close bond with Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, who would remain one of Schacht's most loyal defenders even after the Nazi regime's true nature became unmistakable to the rest of the world. It was Schacht who had stabilized the German currency in 1923, ending the hyperinflation, and it was Schacht whom American bankers trusted to oversee the financial architecture of the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan. He was, in the eyes of Wall Street, their man in Berlin, a reliable, sophisticated, Western-oriented financier who could be counted on to protect foreign investments. And when Hitler came to power in January of 1933, it was Schacht who provided the new regime with something it desperately needed: financial credibility. Schacht engineered what became known as the economic miracle of the Third Reich. The centerpiece of this was a clever financial instrument called Mefo bills, promissory notes issued by a shell company called the Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, which was secretly backed by the Reichsbank. These Mefo bills allowed the Nazi regime to finance massive rearmament while keeping the true scale of military spending hidden from foreign observers, the international bond markets, and even from the German public. The bill circulated among German industrialists like a shadow currency. And by the time foreign governments began to understand the scale of what was happening, the rearmament was already well underway. The numbers were staggering. As the economic historian Adam Tooze meticulously documented in his 2006 book, The Wages of Destruction, Germany's military expenditures exploded from roughly 1.9 billion Reichsmarks in 1933 to more than 32 billion Reichsmarks by 1939, a nearly 17-fold increase in just 6 years. For context, by 1938, Germany was spending roughly 52% of all government expenditure on military programs. No modern economy had ever militarized at that pace. But here's the critical point. The Mefo bills and Schacht's financial engineering only provided the funding mechanism. The actual industrial capacity, the technology, the raw materials, and the manufacturing expertise required to turn that money into a modern military machine, those came in no small part from American corporations. And this is where the story gets really uncomfortable. Let us start with Henry Ford. Ford was arguably the most famous industrialist in America, and he was also one of the most prominent and influential anti-Semites in the Western world. Beginning in 1920, Ford used his newspaper, The Dearborn Independent, which was distributed through Ford dealerships across the country, to publish a series of 91 virulently anti-Semitic articles over the course of nearly 7 years. The paper had a circulation of roughly 700,000 at its peak, making it one of the most widely read publications in America. These articles were later compiled and distributed internationally as a 4-volume set called The International Jew. The book was translated into 16 languages, including German, and became enormously popular in National Socialist circles. Baldur von Schirach, the head of the Hitler Youth, later testified at Nuremberg that he had become anti-Semitic after reading Ford's writings at the age of 17. Adolf Hitler kept a life-size portrait of Henry Ford beside his desk at his Munich office. Ford is the only American mentioned by name in Mein Kampf, where Hitler praises him as the one man who maintained independence from what Hitler called Jewish financial control. In July of 1938, on Ford's 75th birthday, the Nazi government awarded him the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor the Third Reich could bestow on a foreign citizen. Karl Kapp, the German consul in Cleveland, traveled to Dearborn to personally present the medal at a birthday dinner attended by 500 guests. Ford accepted it without hesitation. But this was not merely an ideological affinity. It was business. Ford's German subsidiary, Ford Werk, based in Cologne, was a major producer of trucks and transport vehicles for the Wehrmacht. The factory had been expanded significantly during the 1930s, with investment from the American parent company. As the war progressed, Ford Werke used forced labor, including prisoners from concentration camps, and displaced civilians from across occupied Europe. Ford maintained ownership and managerial influence over Ford Werk throughout the 1930s, and profited handsomely from the relationship. Then there was General Motors. In 1929, GM acquired Adam Opel AG, at the time Germany's largest automobile manufacturer, for $33.3 million. Under GM's ownership and investment, Opel's production capacity expanded dramatically. The Opel Blitz truck became the logistical backbone of the Wehrmacht, used in every theater of operations, from Poland to North Africa. Opel's plants in Rüsselsheim and Brandenburg also produced aircraft engines, components for the Junkers Ju-88 bomber, and torpedo detonators for the German Navy. In 1938, GM's head of overseas operations, James D. Mooney, was personally awarded the Order of the Merit of the German Eagle by Adolf Hitler for his distinguished service to the German automobile industry. Let me say that again because it matters. A senior American corporate executive was personally decorated by Adolf Hitler, and his company continued to operate in Nazi Germany, producing weapon systems without interruption. Now, let us follow the money into something even more strategically critical than trucks and transport. Fuel. Nazi Germany had a fundamental strategic problem that threatened the entire foundation of its war plans. It had almost no domestic oil reserves. Germany's own oil production covered barely 5% of its needs. Without fuel, no tanks roll, no planes fly, no submarines hunt, no war gets fought. And here's where Standard Oil of New Jersey, the most powerful petroleum company in the world, enters the picture. In 1929, Standard Oil entered into a sweeping cartel agreement with IG Farben, the colossal German chemical conglomerate that was, by the mid-1930s, the single largest corporation in all of Europe. With more than 300,000 employees and tentacles reaching into every sector of the German economy. IG Farben was not just a company, it was a state within a state. A cartel formed in 1925 from the merger of 6 major German chemical firms including BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst. By the time the Nazis came to power, IG Farben controlled roughly 100% of Germany's synthetic fuel production, 90% of its plastics, 84% of its explosives, and significant portions of its pharmaceuticals. Under the 1929 agreement with Standard Oil, the two companies agreed to divide the world market between them, with Standard Oil controlling petroleum and IG Farben controlling chemicals. But the most consequential element of the deal was the sharing of hydrogenation technology, the critical process by which coal could be converted into synthetic fuel. This technology transfer was absolutely essential to the Nazi war effort because it allowed Germany to produce fuel domestically from its abundant coal reserves, bypassing its fatal dependence on foreign oil imports. By 1944, synthetic fuel would account for roughly 92% of Germany's aviation gasoline and over 50% of its total fuel supply. But it goes further. Standard Oil's affiliate, the Ethyl Export Corporation, a joint venture with General Motors, provided IG Farben with the technology and raw materials to produce tetraethyl lead, a vital additive for high-octane aviation gasoline. Without tetraethyl lead, the Luftwaffe's high-performance Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf engines could not function at the compression ratios they were designed for. The historian Charles Hyam, in his 1983 book Trading with the Enemy, documented how approximately 500 tons of tetraethyl lead were supplied to IG Farben in the years before the war, and the relationship extended beyond fuel. Standard Oil and IG Farben also collaborated on Buna synthetic rubber, another strategic material that Germany lacked access to naturally, and that was essential for everything from tires to gaskets to insulation on military equipment. Now, it is worth noting that some of Hyam's more specific claims have been debated by historians, and the Standard Oil-IG Farben relationship was complex, involving legitimate commercial arrangements that predated the Nazi regime. But the fundamental fact is not in dispute. American technology was essential to Germany's ability to wage modern mechanized warfare, and the companies providing it knew exactly who they were doing business with. And then there was IBM. This is perhaps the most chilling chapter of the entire story. In June of 1937, Thomas J. Watson, the chairman and president of International Business Machines, traveled to Berlin and was personally awarded the Order of the Merit of the German Eagle by Adolf Hitler. Watson's German subsidiary, Dehomag, provided the Nazi regime with custom-designed Hollerith punch card tabulating machines. These were not generic office equipment. They were precision instruments, designed and configured for specific tasks. The investigative journalist and historian Edwin Black, in his meticulously sourced 2001 book IBM and the Holocaust, documented how these systems were used to conduct the censuses that identified and classified Jewish populations across the Reich, and eventually across all of occupied Europe, to manage the railway logistics that transported millions to ghettos and concentration camps, and to organize the slave labor programs that powered the Nazi war economy. Each punch card, each tabulating machine, required ongoing technical support and maintenance from Dehomag, which remained under IBM's corporate oversight. Black's research demonstrated that IBM's New York headquarters was aware of and facilitated these operations. Watson returned his medal in 1940 after sustained public pressure, but Dehomag's operations in Nazi Germany continued uninterrupted. The list goes on. ITT Corporation, under its president Sosthenes Bain, owned a 28% stake in Focke-Wulf, the German aircraft manufacturer that produced fighter planes and bombers for the Luftwaffe. ITT's German subsidiary, Lorenz AG, built vital communications equipment and switching networks for the Wehrmacht, the very systems that allowed German military commanders to coordinate the Blitzkrieg offensives that would overrun Poland, France, and much of Europe. Bain himself met personally with Hitler in August of 1933, just months after the Nazi seizure of power, to discuss expanding ITT's German operations. Chase National Bank, the predecessor of J.P. Morgan Chase, maintained its Paris branch open during the Nazi occupation of France, where it froze the accounts of Jewish customers while continuing to facilitate financial transactions for German interests. And the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, where John Foster Dulles, the future United States Secretary of State, was a senior partner, handled extensive legal and financial work for German cartels, including IG Farben, and floated massive bond issues for German borrowers throughout the 1930s. Dulles personally negotiated deals that funneled American investment capital into German industry. He did not sever Sullivan and Cromwell's German business relationships until 1935, 2 years after Hitler took power, and the same year the Nuremberg race laws were enacted, the laws that stripped Jewish citizens of their rights and laid the legal groundwork for the Holocaust. These were not rogue employees or subsidiary managers acting without authorization. These were decisions made at the highest levels of American corporate and financial leadership by men who read the newspapers, who understood what the Nazi regime represented, and who chose to continue doing business anyway. Now, you might ask, was any of this illegal? And here is where the story becomes even more troubling. The United States had passed the Trading with the Enemy Act back in 1917 during the First World War. The act gave the federal government the power to seize the assets of individuals and corporations that were conducting business on behalf of enemy nations during wartime. And it was invoked during the Second World War, most notably to seize the assets of the Union Banking Corporation in 1942. But here's the thing. Many of the largest American corporations found ways to maintain their German operations even after the United States entered the war in December of 1941. They did this through a web of subsidiaries incorporated in neutral countries like Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain. Standard Oil routed transactions through neutral intermediaries. ITT maintained contact with its German subsidiaries through its Swiss and Spanish offices. The corporations argued then and later that their German subsidiaries were operating independently, beyond the reach of the American parent company. But the profits, when they eventually came, flowed right back to New York. The Truman Committee, chaired by Senator Harry S. Truman before he became vice president, investigated some of these relationships during the war. Truman himself described Standard Oil's partnership with IG Farben as treasonous, but no criminal charges were ever brought. The companies were too large, too politically connected, and too integral to the American war effort itself to be prosecuted. The very same corporations that had built up Nazi Germany's industrial capacity were also, by 1942, producing the tanks, the planes, and the fuel that American soldiers needed to fight that same enemy. The irony was almost too perfect. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth, and it is one that most people would rather not confront. This was not a conspiracy in the way that word is usually understood. There was no secret meeting in a smoke-filled room where Wall Street executives sat around a mahogany table and decided to build Nazi Germany. What happened was, in many ways, worse than a conspiracy, because it was simply the ordinary logic of capital operating without moral constraint. These companies invested in Germany because Germany was profitable. They transferred technology because technology licensing generated revenue. They maintained operations under the Nazi regime because shutting down and pulling out would have meant writing off millions of dollars in assets and foregoing future profits. The financial incentives were aligned in exactly the wrong direction, at exactly the wrong moment in history. And the institutions that were supposed to provide oversight, the ones that were supposed to prevent American capital and technology from flowing to a regime that was openly persecuting its own citizens, rearming in violation of international treaties and preparing for aggressive war, those institutions failed completely. Consider the Bank for International Settlements. Remember that institution I told you to keep in mind? By the time the war began, the BIS had become an extraordinary nexus where central bankers from Allied and Axis nations continued to do business with one another even as their country's soldiers were killing each other on the battlefield. The American-born president of the BIS from 1940 to 1946 was Thomas Harrington McKittrick, a former Wall Street banker with the firm of Lee Higginson, one of the very same firms that had underwritten German loans in the 1920s. Under McKittrick's leadership, the BIS accepted and processed looted Nazi gold, including gold seized from the central banks of occupied nations like Belgium, the Netherlands, and Czechoslovakia, and, according to a number of historians, gold taken from Holocaust victims. McKittrick maintained the bank's technical neutrality, while the Reichsbank, under the direction of men who reported directly to Hitler, sat on its board and conducted regular transactions. And then there was the Czech gold affair. Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England and a close personal friend of Hjalmar Schacht, facilitated the transfer of approximately 5.6 million pounds of Czechoslovak gold reserves to the Reichsbank in 1939 after Germany annexed Czechoslovakia. The British government protested. Norman proceeded anyway. The gold was routed through the BIS. That is what the machinery of international finance looked like in the 1930s and 1940s. Neutral on paper, complicit in practice. And here is where the story connects to a pattern that should feel uncomfortably familiar to anyone paying close attention to the modern world. After the war ended, after roughly 60 million people lay dead, after the extermination camps were liberated, and the Nuremberg trials documented the machinery of genocide in painstaking detail, What happened to the American corporations that had helped build that machinery? The answer is almost nothing. Ford Motor Company reclaimed Ford Werke in Cologne. General Motors reclaimed its Opel factories. Both companies resumed full control of their German subsidiaries as if nothing had happened. And here's the detail that would be funny if it were not so enraging. Both companies filed claims against the United States government seeking compensation for the damage that Allied bombers had done to their German plants. Plants that had been producing military vehicles and weapons components for the Nazi war machine. Plants that had been using forced labor, and they received it. General Motors was awarded over $33 million in tax exemptions for the Allied bombing damage done to its Opel facilities. Ford received approximately $1.1 million in compensation for damage to Ford Werke. Let me make sure you understand what that means. American taxpayers effectively compensated American corporations for the inconvenience of having their Nazi-era war factories bombed by American planes that were flown by American pilots who were dying to defeat the very military machine those factories had helped to build. IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate whose subsidiary Degesch produced the Zyklon B gas used in the extermination chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau, was broken up by the Allies after the war into its constituent companies. 24 of its executives were indicted at the Nuremberg IG Farben trial in 1947. Only 13 were convicted. Sentences ranged from 1 to 8 years. Most served considerably less. Fritz Termeer, who had been directly responsible for building the IG Auschwitz plant that used concentration camp slave labor, was sentenced to 7 years and served only 4. After his release, he became chairman of the supervisory board of Bayer. And the successor companies, BASF, Bayer, Hoechst, went on to become some of the largest and most profitable chemical and pharmaceutical corporations in the world. Companies that exist today, that you have almost certainly bought products from, whose names are on the medications in your medicine cabinet. No major American corporation was ever criminally prosecuted for its business dealings with Nazi Germany. Not Ford, not GM, not Standard Oil, not IBM, not ITT, not Chase, not one. The historian Anthony Sutton, in his 1976 work, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, argued that Wall Street's involvement was not merely opportunistic, but reflected a deliberate strategic calculation by certain financial elites to build Germany as a bulwark against Soviet communism, even at the cost of enabling fascism. That is a provocative thesis, and not all scholars share it. Adam Tooze's more recent and more rigorously sourced economic analysis in The Wages of Destruction offers a systemic explanation, arguing that American capital flowed to Germany not because of a grand conspiracy, but because the structural incentives of the interwar international financial system made it almost inevitable. Capital seeks returns. German industry offered extraordinary returns in the 1920s and 1930s, and no regulatory framework existed to ask the question that should have been asked at every step. What is this money being used to build? The truth probably lies somewhere between those two poles. But what is not in dispute, what is documented beyond any serious argument, is that the capital flowed, the technology was transferred, the factories were built, and when the time came for Germany to convert that industrial capacity into the most destructive military machine the world had ever seen, everything was already in place. The loans had built the factories, the technology agreements had provided the know-how, the corporate subsidiaries had trained the workforce, and the financial networks had created the channels through which all of it moved. Follow the money. It has always been about the money. And the most sobering lesson of this entire story may be the simplest one. There were warnings. There were people who saw what was happening and said so. Senator Truman called it treason. John Maynard Keynes had predicted catastrophe as far back as 1919. Journalists and diplomats reported on the Nazi regime's true nature throughout the 1930s. Kristallnacht happened in November of 1938. The systematic destruction of Jewish businesses, synagogues, and homes across Germany and Austria, carried out in full view of the world. And American corporations continued to do business in Nazi Germany after Kristallnacht. They continued after the Nuremberg race laws. They continued after Hitler publicly declared his intention to expand German territory by force. The information was available, the warnings were clear, and the money kept flowing because the money always keeps flowing until something forces it to stop. So, the next time someone tells you that Nazi Germany was built purely on ideology and nationalist willpower, remember this. Remember the $1.5 billion in Wall Street loans that rebuilt German industry in the 1920s. Remember the synthetic fuel technology that gave the Luftwaffe its wings. Remember the punch card machines that organized a genocide with industrial efficiency. Remember the trucks that rolled off American-owned assembly lines to carry soldiers to the front and prisoners to the camps. And remember that after it was all over, after 60 million dead and an entire continent in ruins, the corporations that made it possible got their factories back, collected their compensation, and never spent a single day in court. That is not a story about evil individuals making evil choices in isolation. It is a story about a system in which capital was allowed to operate without conscience, without accountability, and without borders. A system in which profit was the only metric that mattered, and human life was an externality to be managed, not a value to be protected. And if you think that system has fundamentally changed since 1945, I would encourage you to look more carefully at the world around you. Because the technology is different now. The geographies are different. The names on the buildings have changed. But the logic, the cold, calculating logic of capital flowing wherever returns, are highest regardless of the human cost. That has not changed at all. If this story changed how you think about who really built Nazi Germany, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if this shifted your perspective, and leave a comment telling me which part of this story surprised you the most. Was it the Ford medal? The IBM punch cards? The fact that these companies were compensated for having their war factories bombed? I read every single comment, and I am genuinely curious what you took from this. There are more stories like this one, stories about the financial forces that operate behind the headlines, the money that moves in the shadows, while the textbooks point you somewhere else. Follow the money. It will always tell you the real story. I will see you in the next one.